Danger at Diablo, Chapter 14. A Discovery. It was hot and dusty along the steep hill trail that led to distant jump-off. The posse rode slowly and with much complaint. It was a long ride, and, they argued among themselves, if McTavish and his gang had stolen the money, as the stranger claimed, they would be long gone from the ambush spot by now. Just the same, the posse kept their guns ready and their eyes alert as they rode. Rango kept in the lead, and Lofty and Ben Crane followed him closely. Shanley would have liked to catch up with Rango and find out privately what had really happened at the ambush, but he didn't get a chance. He would have to wait. Annie rode in silence, unhappy and confused over the situation. She knew that some of the men accepted Rango's story without question, but some of them did not. They had known Uncle Luke too long to believe the word of a stranger. Annie was hoping hard that Rango's story hadn't been true. Maybe, she admitted, there had been some kind of an outlaw attack, just as he claimed, and maybe Uncle Luke had shot at Rango. But if so, Luke must have been hurt or confused and hadn't realized what he was doing. But that opened another frightening possibility. Maybe the outlaws had hurt Uncle Luke badly, and they would find him out here, wounded, or... She refused to say the frightening word, even in her thoughts. She was worried sick and wished they could travel faster, but the trail was steep and dangerous, and they had to plod along. Up ahead, Rango pulled up and signaled for a halt. The trail was narrow and overgrown here, and the tracks, which Annie had been studying all the way, were suddenly lost in the hoofprints of other horses. The dirt was kicked up as if a struggle had taken place. "This is the place," Rango called out. Annie pulled toward the edge and looked over. There was a sheer drop of many feet to where the tops of trees made a solid concealing mass. Target's foot kicked a small boulder. She could hear it bounding down for what seemed like half a minute. She drew back from the edge and guided the nervous cowpony ahead to join Rango and Lofty. Rango pointed across the deep canyon toward a big outcrop of rocks, jumbled together on the steep hillside. "That's where his gang was hiding when they took the shot at me and missed," he announced. The posse studied the rocks across the way. There was no evidence of life there now. No sunlight glittered on rifle barrels. The posse breathed easier to a man. "Where's the rock over here that you said the bullet smacked into?" Annie challenged Rango. "It should be around here somewhere, if you didn't imagine it." Rango looked at her with cordial dislike and moved ahead slowly, searching the rocks that lined the wall of the trail. Shanley followed, pushing past the others and pretending to help him hunt. "I hope you didn't lie about that shot," he whispered. "She doesn't believe you." Annie's keen eyes scanned the rocky wall beside the trail. Lofty, tall in the saddle, was the first to spot the splash of lead on the granite up high. He stood in his stirrups and moved a mesquite bush out of the way to show it to Annie. Her heart sank. Rango's story about someone shooting from across the canyon was true. She could tell by the narrow area in which the bullet had spattered that it had come a considerable distance, and the angle at which it had chipped off slivers of granite proved that it had actually been fired from somewhere near that rocky outcrop across the way, just as he had told them. Her eyes met Rango's. He was smiling coldly. "Well?" he asked. Annie nodded and turned away. She was too worried to be able to give him an answer just then. Lofty dug out the spent bullet and dropped it in his pocket. Rango dismounted and picked up a second lead slug from the dirt. He handed it to Lofty with a mocking smile. "Here, take this one, too. It ought to fit your crooked sheriff's gun. It's probably the one he nicked me with." Annie began to ride ahead slowly, studying the ground closely as she went. Shanley and Rango exchanged uneasy glances as she wheeled suddenly and cantered back. She wore a puzzled look as she spoke to Shanley, ignoring Rango. "My uncle's horse had one crooked shoe," she told Shanley. "All the way here I've been able to pick up his trail by that track, but there's no sign of it beyond here." "So?" Rango shrugged it off. "Maybe his gang brought him a fresh horse because his was lame or tired." "There's no sign that Uncle's gray was lame, and he's often ridden at 30 miles in a day," she insisted. "So why would it be tired after going less than 5? "I'll ask him when we catch him," Rango said angrily. "How does anybody know why a man changes horses? Maybe the gray was saddle sore, or the other horse was faster." Rango turned away abruptly to the other members of the posse. "I guess we'd just be wasting your time, gents, trying to track an old fox like McTavish. By now he's well on his way to the border." John Shanley shook his head. Looks like it, Rango. But Lofty here can wire his description to every town within 50 miles and warn them to be on the lookout for him. I hate to go on record against a man I've always thought so much of, but I guess it's up to me, as the heavy loser, to offer a reward for him." He turned to Lofty with a sigh. "Better make it 500, deputy, dead or alive." Annie gave a horrified exclamation. "No, please!" Rango spoke harshly. "Why not? Are you still stupid enough to think I'm lying?" "I don't know if I'm stupid or not, but I know my Uncle Luke. He couldn't be a thief and a leader of a gang of outlaws. I don't care what you say." "Ugh!" Rango waved her aside. "Women." Ben Crane spoke for the first time. His voice was gentler than usual as he addressed Annie. "I've known Luke a lot longer than anybody else in this bunch, Annie, and there was a time when I thought I knew him mighty well. But men change, and it looks like your uncle's changed along with many another. It's the gold fever does it, and we can all understand it even if we want to see justice done to any lawbreakers, no matter who they are. But there's no evidence against Uncle Luke, only this man's word, this stranger." Annie's voice was desperate. "Mr. Rango is no stranger to me," John Shanley said sternly. "He's a reputable citizen of Jump-Off, and I must take his word as to what has happened, because there is no evidence to contradict it." "Now wait." Rango glared at Annie. "I don't like you calling me a liar, Miss Know-it-all. From what I hear around Diablo, your uncle has been pretty slack about enforcing the law, and I'll lay a bet if we took a good look around that bullseye ranch of his, we'd find plenty of signs that this wasn't his first robbery." Annie flared angrily. "Why don't you, every one of you, come along right now and look? You won't find anything because there's nothing to find." "Now, Miss Annie," Ben Crane tried to soothe her, "that won't be necessary at all." He frowned at Rango. "Sounds like a good idea to me." Rango winked at John Shanley, unnoticed by the others. "Come on." Annie headed Target back toward Diablo. "And you better keep up with me," she flung at Rango, "so you can be sure I don't destroy any evidence." "If that's the way she feels about it, let's go," Ben Crane advised them. "Me, I'm still sitting on the fence, and I'm waiting to see which way to jump." Annie kept up a fast pace all the way back to the ranch. She was so sure that they would find nothing to prove Uncle Luke had done anything wrong that she could hardly wait to get there with the posse. The men had to push their horses to keep up with the fleet-footed Target. Lofty rode close to Rango all the way, and the disgusted outlaw had no chance to talk to John Shanley in private. Shanley tried a couple of times to speed up and get alongside Rango. He wanted very much to know what had really happened out here, but each time he tried, Lofty was within hearing distance. Tag was still perched up in the cottonwood lookout post as the riders swept into view along the ranch road. He had been curled up in the crotch of the tree, half asleep, when the pounding of hooves brought him suddenly awake. He peered out, expecting to see Rufe Horton and at least one other outlaw. Instead, he saw Annie riding at the head of more than a half a dozen men. He dropped out of the tree as she rode into the yard, with Lofty and the rest of the riders close behind her. "Hi, Annie!" he yelled. She pulled to a sliding stop. "Hiya!" she called, but her usual flashing smile was absent. She looked tired and worried as she swung to the ground. "Lofty, you can show them in," she told the deputy. Lofty nodded gloomily and started for the front door. He was still convinced that Ben Crane was back of the whole thing, and he was afraid that something had happened to Luke, no matter what anybody said. He had made up his mind that as soon as these men got through looking for something here that they would never find, he would have a long talk with John Shanley and see what he thought about Ben Crane. Annie threw the reins over Target's head and let them trail on the ground. The posse was waiting uneasily. She waved her hand toward the house. "Help yourselves, gentlemen," she called. "Start anywhere you like, and don't miss anything." Ben Crane looked sheepish and fussed over his saddle, but he made no move toward the door. The other men of the posse filed up onto the porch. John Shanley came and stood beside Annie. She smiled soberly at him. "Please go in with them, Mr. Shanley. Then I'll be sure nobody has a chance to lie about finding something. At least I'll have one witness I can trust." Rango stopped a couple feet away. "Spunky, ain't you?" he drawled. "Too bad it's wasted." Annie turned her shoulder to him. At the front door, Lofty was making the posse men wipe the dust off their shoes before he would let them go inside his boss's house. "What are they looking for, Annie?" Tag was puzzled. "They don't know," Annie answered dryly, "but they won't find anything in there that shouldn't be in honest folks' houses." "Annie, I forgot to tell you, Rufe Horton didn't show up," Tag reported. "I watched real hard for him." Rango threw a quick side look at Shanley, who kept his face expressionless. Loudly, so that Ben Crane couldn't miss hearing, Rango repeated, "Rufe Horton? Isn't that the horse thief your uncle let out of jail?" The one that escaped, Annie corrected him angrily. Annie was afraid he'd come back again, so I was keeping watch for him like a sentry, Tag explained proudly. Ben Crane strode over, scowling. He towered over Tag. How often has Horton been here, Sonny? We only saw him once. That is, Annie did. I didn't. She scared him off. He looked at his big sister. Didn't you, sis? She nodded soberly. She could see suspicion in Ben Crane's face. Crane's eyes met Shanley's. Shanley managed to look bewildered and worried. He had a hard time keeping the triumph that he felt out of his eyes. He knew what Crane was thinking now, that this proved that the ranch was a hangout for the outlaws. It was all working out much better than Shanley had dared to hope. We'd better go in and see that they don't upset the whole house, Shanley spoke briskly. It was better to let Crane think it over without trying to add anything to that neatly planted suspicion. He led the way, holding Annie's arm. Tag and the scowling Ben Crane followed. Rango watched them, smiling. There was no reason for him to go inside. He knew what they would find. The men had begun the search in the big, cool living room. They were nervous and awkward. They didn't know just what it was they were looking for, and they didn't know where to start. Lofty stood off, thumbs hooked in his belt, glaring at them defiantly. A bit sheepishly, the men made a hurried search of the ceiling-high old desk, and one of them even looked vaguely into the wood box beside the fireplace. He wasn't sure what he expected to find there, but it seemed a good place to look. Sawdust, splinters, and spiders were the best he could turn up. What's this room? One of the men pointed a thumb towards Annie's room. That's Sis's room. Tag stood in the front of the door with his fist doubled. And you better keep your noses out of there. Hush, Tag. Go ahead and look, Annie told the man cheerfully. But he backed off in an embarrassed haste, and the door stayed shut. He followed Ben Crane and John Shanley into Sheriff Luke's room. Annie pulled Tag to her and put an arm over his shoulders. Don't get upset, honey, she told him. They think they're doing their duty. Let him look. There's nothing to hurt Uncle Luke in this house. Lofty spoke angrily from beside the fireplace. It's a good thing there's enough of them looking so that they can keep tabs on each other. I don't trust any of them, and I've got an idea who could stand the most watching. That Ben Crane. There was a sudden, excited exclamation from Luke's room. Here, look in the wardrobe. It was Ben's booming voice. Look what was hid back of his clothes. Why, it's an empty canvas sack from the Bonanza City Bank. That was John Shanley's voice. Then Crane roared. That's the one my payroll money was in. Look, my bank slip's still inside of it. And that's the end of chapter 14. Come back tomorrow to find out what happens next.